Timothy was a young man whose simple life became a powerful example of faith and dedication. Raised amidst two distinct cultures, he stood out for his courage and willingness to answer God's call, even in the face of challenges that seemed greater than he could bear. Throughout his life, Timothy faced opposition, pressures, and even his own physical weaknesses. But at every step, he proved to be an example of obedience and trust in God. More than that, he was living proof that when we respond to the divine call, our limitations become opportunities for God's strength to be revealed. This is a story of Timothy, a narrative that inspires, challenges, and reminds us that God's purpose never fails. It is a story of faith, courage, and fidelity that, even centuries later, still speaks to our hearts. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories, and activate the notification bell to avoid missing any videos. Lystra was a quiet town, almost forgotten by time, where the hills seemed to whisper ancient secrets to the wind. It was there that Timothy was born into a home marked by contrast. His father, a Greek with a rational spirit, viewed life with pragmatism, while his mother, Eunice, carried the flame of Jewish faith in her heart. Eunice, in turn, had learned about the divine promises from her mother, Lois, and together they formed a strong bond, weaving sacred stories into young Timothy's soul. From an early age, Timothy seemed different. He wasn't just an attentive boy. It was as if he had an internal beacon guiding him towards something beyond the ordinary. While other children ran through the dusty streets, he would sit at his mother and grandmother's feet, listening with bright eyes to the tales of God's great deeds. It was a childhood that, at first glance, seemed simple, but in truth was being shaped by the extraordinary. His home, a mosaic of cultures, echoed both Greek wisdom and Jewish prophecies. Timothy lived between these two realities like a thread that united opposite worlds. When his mother recited the Psalms, he could feel something vibrating in his spirit, as if each word had been written especially for him. It was impossible not to notice that something greater was being planted there, even if he did not yet understand what it was. As days passed, his life continued in silence, like the waters of a river that run quietly before finding rapids. But in that calm, God was already acting, weaving the first threads of destiny that would lead him to a transformative encounter. Years passed, and Timothy grew. His face still bore the serene expression of someone seeking to understand the world around him. But there was something about him that caught everyone's attention in Lystra. Yes, he was young, but his maturity impressed those who saw him. At Christian community meetings, you could feel that his faith was not just a repetition of what he had learned from his mother and grandmother. It was something deeper, like a tree that roots beyond the visible, seeking waters that nourish the invisible. Timothy was known for his gentleness and for a calmness that seemed to contradict the intensity of his dedication. When he spoke, his words resonated like well-composed music, reflecting not only knowledge but also wisdom. It was not difficult for the elders of the community to recognize that there was something special about him, as if he carried within himself a glow that did not come from him. The Christians who visited Lystra always left with something to say about the young man. He had become a sort of reference point, a flame that kept the community warm in difficult times. But Timothy, with all his quietness and humility, never saw himself that way. For him, faith was like a trail to be followed, and he was just taking one step at a time, without imagining where the path would lead him. It was in this context that he began to hear stories about a man named Paul, a daring missionary, who traveled from city to city preaching about the Messiah with a passion that changed everything wherever he went. Timothy, intrigued, wondered what it would be like to meet someone like that, someone who seemed to carry a fire similar to the one burning in his own heart. And then, one ordinary afternoon, the unexpected happened. The day dawned like any other in Lystra. The market buzzed with voices. The smell of freshly baked bread floated in the air, and the residents went about their routines. Timothy, as always, was at home helping Eunice with chores and listening attentively to some passage that his mother read aloud. But that day, something different was going to happen. The news spread quickly like wildfire. Paul, the missionary whom so many spoke of, was in the city. He had arrived accompanied by Silas, bringing stories of miracles, healings, and words that shook the hardest souls. Paul's presence in the main square caused a stir. People gathered curiously, some with skepticism, others with hope written on their faces. Timothy, taken by a curiosity he could barely contain, decided to go there. When Timothy saw Paul, he did not see just an ordinary preacher. There was something about that man that left him speechless, as if his very presence carried the force of thunder. Paul spoke with passion, his voice cutting through the air like blades that revealed the deepest truths. He spoke of Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior. For Timothy, every word seemed like an echo of what he already felt in his heart, but had never been able to express. When Paul's eyes met Timothy's, something indescribable happened. It was as if the missionary saw in him not just a young man standing there, but the potential that God had planted from the beginning. Paul saw the living faith of Eunice and Lois shining in that gaze, but also something even deeper, a steadfast willingness to follow God's call, no matter the cost. After finishing his sermon, Paul approached Timothy. The moment was simple but laden with significance. In a few exchanged words, it became clear that this encounter was much more than a coincidence. It was the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The meeting with Paul left Timothy restless. It was not just admiration. It was as if an invisible bell had been rung in his soul, calling him to something greater. While people returned to their routines, he remained thoughtful, like someone who, looking at the horizon, realizes there is much more beyond what the eyes can see. It didn't take long for Paul to seek him out again, this time a proposal that would change everything. With a firm but loving conversation, Paul made it clear that he saw a special purpose in Timothy. He did not just speak with words, but with his eyes of someone who had suffered for Christ and knew how to recognize those willing to do the same. Timothy felt the weight of that responsibility, but at the same time, there was an inexplicable peace, as if he had finally found a path he had always been seeking. However, there was a detail that needed to be addressed. Although his mother was Jewish and he had been raised according to the scriptures, the fact that his father was Greek posed a certain challenge. Paul knew that to avoid conflicts and facilitate ministry among the Jews, Timothy would need to be circumcised. It was a demand that seemed tough, but Timothy did not hesitate. His response was simple. He would do whatever was necessary to serve. This act of obedience and surrender was like a seal of his willingness. Timothy was not just a disciple. He was Paul's spiritual son, someone who shared not only the teachings but also the mission. From that moment, he was no longer the shy young man from Lystra. Under Paul's guidance, Timothy would begin to traverse unknown lands, face dangers, and above all, witness the transformative power of the gospel. With Paul, he took his first steps outside Lystra. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Timothy was not afraid. There was something greater awaiting him, and the journey was only beginning, with the dust of the road rising under his feet. Timothy began to experience the world beyond Lystra. Alongside Paul, he became part of something much greater than he had ever imagined. Each city they entered was a new opportunity to see the gospel in action, but also a reminder that following Christ brought challenges. At every step, Timothy was confronted with the reality of a faith that was not just words but life, courage, and often sacrifice. In Philippi, he witnessed something he would never forget. Paul and Silas, after freeing a possessed girl, faced the fury of the residents. They were imprisoned and flogged. Timothy saw up close the marks of pain on the bodies of those who guided him, and yet he heard songs echoing from the prison. That unshakable faith ignited something in his heart. He understood that following Christ meant walking in the light, even when everything around seemed dark. From Philippi to Thessalonica and then to Berea, the young disciple began to understand the challenges of ministry. It was not just about preaching. It was about listening, comforting, teaching, and sometimes fleeing from angry crowds. In Berea, he saw how some eagerly searched the scriptures, while in Thessalonica, rejection and persecution forced him to leave in a hurry. Each city seemed to carry its own mystery, a mix of acceptance and resistance. Timothy not only observed but participated. He carried messages, strengthened the brothers in faith, and assisted Paul in every way he could. Even when the pressure increased, his determination grew. In the midst of chaos, he discovered a strength within himself that he did not know he possessed. It was like a lit torch guiding him through paths that, although dangerous, were filled with purpose. It was during this journey full of ups and downs that Paul began to entrust Timothy with more and more responsibilities. When Paul entrusted Timothy with the leadership of the church in Ephesus, many raised their eyebrows. After all, he was too young for such a great task. Ephesus was not just any city. It was a bustling metropolis full of challenges. The local church faced heresies, internal conflicts, and the constant pressure of the surrounding world. For any leader, it would be a heavy burden, but for Timothy, it seemed almost impossible. Almost. He arrived with an anxious heart, but full of faith. The streets of Ephesus pulsed with the sound of traveling merchants and devotees of the Temple of Artemis, which dominated the landscape like an imposing shadow. Timothy knew he was not just taking care of the congregation. He was defending a truth that many did not want to hear. Even so, he did not back down. The courage he had learned alongside Paul now needed to be put into practice. At first, it was not easy. Some questioned his youth. Others thought he did not have enough experience to lead. But Timothy, firm as a rock resisting the waves, remembered Paul's words. Let no one despise you for your youth, but be an example to the faithful. He did not just preach. He lived what he taught, showing day after day that his age was not an obstacle for God's power to act. Timothy faced constant struggles, dealing with false teachers spreading deceptive doctrines. He needed to be both firm and wise, using the scriptures as a sword and love as his armor. Paul's letters provided crucial support, reminding Timothy that he was not alone. Paul warned him of future dangers and encouraged him to rekindle his spiritual gifts. Despite his health challenges, Timothy persisted, drawing strength from his faith. As pressures increased in Ephesus, Timothy relied on prayer and God's guidance. Meanwhile, Paul, sensing his days were numbered, wrote with urgency. News of Paul's imprisonment in Rome deeply affected Timothy, who felt a silent farewell in Paul's letters. Although separated by distance and responsibilities, Timothy felt closer to Paul than ever, seeing his own battles as a continuation of Paul's mission. The growing persecution of Christians and the targeting of Paul weighed heavily on Timothy, but he remained steadfast in upholding the gospel's legacy. To be with Paul one last time, the wind cut cold as Timothy traversed the roads leading to Rome. He had made the decision, even knowing that leaving Ephesus could be risky. Heresy still threatened the church, and the challenges were constant. But something inside him said he needed to go. Paul's words in his last letter echoed like a call impossible to ignore. Come quickly before winter. Timothy knew it was not just about the approaching season, but about the time that seemed to be slipping away quickly. The journey was long and full of dangers. Timothy encountered Roman soldiers patrolling the roads and heard rumors of the growing persecution of Christians. In every village he stopped in, He felt the weight of insecurity, but none of this made him retreat. He remembered Paul's teachings about courage and faith and pressed on, determined to arrive before it was too late. When he finally saw Rome, the city did not look like the stories he had heard. The grandeur of the place was overshadowed by a dark atmosphere of tension and fear. The persecution of Christ's followers was intense, and Paul's name was spoken in whispers. Timothy did his best to go unnoticed as he made his way to the place where his mentor was imprisoned. Each step seemed laden with anxiety, but also a silent hope that he could still hear Paul's voice one more time. Upon arrival, he was led to the cell where Paul was. The sight of his mentor left him speechless. Paul seemed weaker, more worn by time and suffering, but his eyes shone with the same passion as always. The reunion was silent at first, but full of meaning. Timothy felt that this moment was a gift, an opportunity to receive more than words. But the very spirit of faith and perseverance that Paul carried. The cell was cold, but the atmosphere was warmed by the presence of two souls sharing an unbreakable bond. Timothy listened to Paul attentively, absorbing every word as if it were the last. There was something in Paul's tone that mixed serenity and urgency. He spoke about the fight of faith, the price of following Christ, but also about the glory that awaited those who persevered. His words were not of lamentation, but of someone who knew he was about to cross the boundary between the temporal and the eternal. Timothy felt the weight of that moment. He was not just listening to a mentor, he was witnessing the conclusion of a life that had been wholly dedicated to God's purpose. Paul's physical weakness contrasted with the strength of his words, which resonated like thunder on a silent night. The young man knew that from then on, he would carry not only Paul's memories, but also the mission they had shared. When the time came to leave, Timothy did so with a heavy heart, but with a new determination. Paul had finished his race, but Timothy's journey was just beginning. He returned to Ephesus carrying the weight of everything he had experienced, but also a stronger flame ignited by his mentor's last words. The days in Rome marked his life, but they were not the end of his challenges. Timothy continued to lead, face persecutions, and keep alive the message Paul had so dedicatedly proclaimed. Even in moments of loneliness and weakness, he knew he was not alone. The seeds planted by Paul and watered by God flourished in his life, making him a symbol of faithfulness and courage. Indeed, Timothy's story remains alive, not only in the pages of Scripture, but also in the heart of all who seek to serve God with perseverance. His life reminds us that the divine call always comes with challenges, but also with a strength only God can provide. Timothy's life was not marked by grand deeds that drew human attention, but by his constancy in following the purpose given to him. He did not seek the spotlight, but remained faithful to call, even in the most difficult moments. The young man who began as Paul's apprentice became a firm leader, a loving pastor, and a voice that echoed truth in times of confusion. His story is a reminder that God does not choose the strongest or most prepared, but those willing to trust and obey. The years following Paul's death were not easy. Timothy faced even more intense persecutions, but never strayed from the path. He continued to preach, teach, and care for flock entrusted to him. Some traditions suggest he faced martyrdom, defending his faith to his last breath, while others believe he lived to an old age, always faithful to his call. Whatever the outcome, one thing is certain. His life was a living testimony of God's power to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. What can we learn from him? Timothy teaches us that it does not matter who we are or where we come from. What matters is our willingness to respond to God's call. He shows us that true strength is not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to move forward even when everything seems difficult. His faithfulness, even in trials, reminds us that God walks beside those who trust in him. Timothy also teaches us the value of having spiritual mentors, people who guide and prepare us to face life's challenges with wisdom. Just as he had Paul, we are called to learn but also to pass on what we have received. His story is an invitation to live with purpose, knowing that in the end, what matters is not the size of challenges but the faithfulness with which we face them. If you enjoyed Timothy's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful biblical lessons